Empaths are often misunderstood because people assume their compassion means unlimited forgiveness. On the surface, they seem patient, understanding, and willing to see the best in others even when behavior is questionable. But what many fail to realize is that empathy does not erase boundaries. In fact, it often makes them more aware of emotional harm, not less. One of the most important truths about empaths is that they do not respond to emotional harm in the way most people expect. They are often patient, understanding, and willing to give others the benefit of the doubt. Because of this, many people assume that empaths will forgive anything if enough time passes or if an apology is given. However, this assumption misunderstands how emotional memory and trust actually work for them. An empath can understand mistakes. They can understand emotional reactions, poor decisions, stress responses, and even moments of weakness. They are often able to see the reasons behind behavior that others would immediately judge. This understanding creates the impression that they are endlessly forgiving. But understanding is not the same as acceptance, and compassion is not the same as tolerance. What empaths struggle to forgive is not imperfection, but repeated emotional injury. A single mistake can often be processed, explained, and even forgiven if it is followed by genuine change. However, when the same pattern continues, something deeper begins to shift internally. They start to recognize that the issue is not accidental but consistent. This is where emotional patterns become extremely important. Empaths are highly sensitive to consistency and inconsistency in behavior. They notice when apologies are not followed by change. They observe when respect is given in one moment and withdrawn in another. They pay attention to how someone behaves over time, rather than how they behave in isolated situations. At first, they may try to make sense of these patterns. They may give additional chances, offer understanding, and attempt to explain the behavior in a way that allows the relationship to continue. They often believe in the potential of people, not just their current actions. This is one of the reasons they can stay in situations longer than they should. However, emotional memory plays a major role in what happens next. Empaths remember how experiences feel. They do not simply record events, they record emotional impact. A pattern of disrespect, inconsistency, or betrayal creates an internal emotional record that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Over time, this record begins to change how they perceive the person involved. Even if the empath continues to interact normally on the surface, their internal experience is different. Trust begins to weaken. Emotional safety begins to decrease. The sense of openness that once existed starts to fade. What many people misunderstand is that empaths rarely announce this change. They do not always express it through anger or confrontation. Instead, they often become quieter. They observe more and reveal less. Their emotional energy begins to withdraw gradually rather than suddenly. This withdrawal is not impulsive. It is the result of accumulated experiences that have reached a threshold. When emotional effort is repeatedly met with inconsistency, the empath begins to recognize that continuing to invest in the relationship comes at a personal cost. At that point, self-protection becomes more important than hope. Forgiveness, in the traditional sense, may still exist. They may not carry hatred or desire for revenge. But access changes. Emotional closeness is no longer automatic. Vulnerability is no longer freely offered. The relationship becomes more distant, even if communication continues. This is often the moment people realize they have lost something important, not because of a single event, but because of a pattern that was underestimated. What they are experiencing is not sudden change, but the final stage of a long internal process the empath has already gone through. Once that shift happens, it is rarely reversed easily. The empath has already learned that emotional safety depends on consistency, not intention. And when consistency is broken too many times, the decision to step back becomes a form of stability rather than punishment. In the end, what empaths never truly forgive is not human imperfection, but repeated emotional dishonesty expressed through behavior. They can understand almost anything once. What they cannot continue to accept is the same emotional injury happening again and again under the assumption that understanding means unlimited access. Another crucial aspect of how empaths respond to emotional harm is their sensitivity to patterns rather than isolated events. While most people evaluate relationships based on individual moments, empaths naturally zoom out and observe the overall behavior across time. This means that a single mistake may not define someone in their eyes, but repeated behavior almost always will. At the beginning, empaths tend to give space for human error. They understand that people are not perfect and that emotions, stress, or confusion can lead to mistakes. Because of this mindset, they often do not react strongly to one-off incidents. Instead, they observe, reflect, and try to understand the intention behind the action. However, when the same type of emotional injury continues to happen, their perception begins to change. What once felt like an exception starts to look like a pattern. This shift is very important because it changes how trust is built and maintained. Trust for an empath is not based only on words or promises, but on consistency over time. As patterns repeat, emotional safety slowly decreases. Even if the empath continues to engage normally on the surface, something internal begins to shift. They start becoming more cautious in how much they share, how deeply they invest, and how openly they express themselves. This is not a conscious punishment, but a natural protective response. Empaths are highly aware of emotional consistency. They notice when apologies do not lead to change, when promises are repeatedly broken, or when behavior fluctuates between care and neglect. These inconsistencies accumulate in their memory, forming a deeper emotional understanding of the relationship. Over time, this accumulation creates distance. Not necessarily physical distance, but emotional distance. The empath may still be present, still kind, and still respectful, but their emotional involvement is no longer the same. They begin to protect their inner world more carefully. What makes this process significant is that it is often silent. The other person may not realize anything has changed until the emotional connection feels weaker or less available. By that point, the empath has already processed a long history of emotional data and reached a conclusion internally. This is why empaths are often described as forgiving but not forgetful. They may not hold resentment, but they do remember patterns clearly. Their memory is not focused on revenge, but on understanding what is safe and what is not safe for their emotional well-being. In the end, the breaking point for an empath is not usually one dramatic moment. It is the realization that a pattern has not changed despite multiple chances. Once that realization becomes clear, emotional boundaries naturally strengthen, and access to their deeper trust becomes significantly reduced. Another important aspect of how empaths process emotional harm is their internal recording of emotional consistency. Unlike people who focus mainly on isolated events, empaths naturally track how someone behaves over time. They do not rely only on what is said in a single moment, but on how behavior repeats, shifts, and evolves across different situations. At first, empaths tend to approach relationships with openness and understanding. They give people space to make mistakes and do not immediately assign negative meaning to every action. This comes from their ability to see context and intention. If someone acts poorly once, they often consider stress, misunderstanding, or emotional pressure as possible explanations. However, when behavior begins to repeat, their perception starts to change. A single mistake may be forgiven, but a pattern cannot be ignored. This is where empaths begin to shift from emotional patience to emotional analysis. They start noticing whether apologies lead to change or whether the same cycle continues again and again. This pattern recognition is one of their strongest traits. They remember emotional experiences not just as events, but as sequences. They connect moments together and form a larger picture of how someone treats them over time. This allows them to see beyond surface behavior and understand the true consistency of a person's actions. As these patterns continue, emotional safety begins to weaken. The empath may still act normal on the outside, but internally they start becoming more cautious. They share less, reveal less, and invest their emotional energy more carefully. This is not immediate withdrawal, but a gradual internal shift. One of the most misunderstood parts of this process is that it often happens silently. There is no dramatic confrontation or obvious warning sign. Instead, the empath slowly reduces emotional access based on what they have observed. The other person may not realize this change until the connection already feels different. Empaths are not driven by revenge or anger in this process. They are driven by recognition. Once they recognize that a pattern is consistent and unlikely to change, they begin adjusting their emotional boundaries accordingly. This is a form of self-protection rather than punishment. Over time, this leads to a significant emotional shift. The empath may still be kind, respectful, and even supportive, but the depth of emotional connection is no longer the same. Trust becomes limited, vulnerability becomes controlled, and access to their inner world becomes restricted. What makes this especially important is that empaths rarely forget emotional patterns. Even if they forgive on the surface, they remember how situations made them feel and how often those feelings were repeated. This memory shapes how much emotional risk they are willing to take in the future. In essence, what empaths struggle to forgive is not human imperfection, but repeated emotional inconsistency. One mistake can be understood, but repeated behavior creates clarity. Once clarity is reached, emotional boundaries naturally shift, and the relationship is no longer experienced in the same way as before. Another important aspect of how empaths process emotional harm is their internal recording of emotional consistency. Unlike people who focus mainly on isolated events, empaths naturally track how someone behaves over time. They do not rely only on what is said in a single moment, but on how behavior repeats, shifts, and evolves across different situations. At first, empaths tend to approach relationships with openness and understanding. They give people space to make mistakes and do not immediately assign negative meaning to every action. This comes from their ability to see context and intention. If someone acts poorly once, they often consider stress, misunderstanding, or emotional pressure as possible explanations. However, when behavior begins to repeat, their perception starts to change. A single mistake may be forgiven, but a pattern cannot be ignored. This is where empaths begin to shift from emotional patience to emotional analysis. They start noticing whether apologies lead to change or whether the same cycle continues again and again. This pattern recognition is one of their strongest traits. They remember emotional experiences not just as events, but as sequences. They connect moments together and form a larger picture of how someone treats them over time. This allows them to see beyond surface behavior and understand the true consistency of a person's actions. As these patterns continue, emotional safety begins to weaken. The empath may still act normal on the outside, but internally they start becoming more cautious. They share less, reveal less, and invest their emotional energy more carefully. This is not immediate withdrawal, but a gradual internal shift. One of the most misunderstood parts of this process is that it often happens silently. There is no dramatic confrontation or obvious warning sign. Instead, the empath slowly reduces emotional access based on what they have observed. The other person may not realize this change until the connection already feels different. Empaths are not driven by revenge or anger in this process. They are driven by recognition. Once they recognize that a pattern is consistent and unlikely to change, they begin adjusting their emotional boundaries accordingly. This is a form of self-protection rather than punishment. Over time, this leads to a significant emotional shift. The empath may still be kind, respectful, and even supportive, but the depth of emotional connection is no longer the same. Trust becomes limited, vulnerability becomes controlled, and access to their inner world becomes restricted. What makes this especially important is that empaths rarely forget emotional patterns. Even if they forgive on the surface, they remember how situations made them feel and how often those feelings were repeated. This memory shapes how much emotional risk they are willing to take in the future. In essence, what empaths struggle to forgive is not human imperfection, but repeated emotional inconsistency. One mistake can be understood, but repeated behavior creates clarity. Once clarity is reached, emotional boundaries naturally shift, and the relationship is no longer experienced in the same way as before. Another important dimension of how empaths respond to emotional harm is the gradual process of emotional withdrawal that happens when trust is repeatedly tested. This withdrawal is not sudden or dramatic. It develops slowly over time as the empath processes repeated experiences and begins to recognize that emotional safety is no longer consistent. At the beginning of relationships, empaths tend to be open, trusting, and emotionally engaged. They invest deeply because they naturally seek meaningful connection and understanding. When someone makes a mistake, they often try to interpret it through a compassionate lens. They consider context, intention, and emotional state rather than immediately assuming negative meaning. However, when emotional inconsistency continues, their internal processing changes. Instead of viewing each event separately, they begin connecting patterns. They notice how often promises are broken, how frequently apologies are repeated without real change, and how emotional behavior fluctuates over time. This repeated cycle becomes more important than any single moment. As these patterns accumulate, emotional safety begins to weaken. The empath may still appear calm and engaged externally, but internally, they start reducing emotional exposure. They become more selective about what they share and how deeply they invest. This is not an emotional reaction driven by anger, but a logical adjustment based on experience. One of the key features of this process is silence. Empaths rarely announce when they are pulling back emotionally. Instead, they observe, reflect, and gradually adjust their level of involvement. The other person may not notice these changes immediately because communication continues, but the emotional depth behind it has already shifted. This is where many misunderstandings occur. People often assume that if the empath is still present, everything is fine. In reality, presence does not always equal emotional availability. The empath may still participate in conversation, offer support, or remain respectful, but the level of trust and vulnerability is no longer the same. Empaths are highly sensitive to emotional consistency, and inconsistency creates internal records that are difficult to ignore. Even if they choose to forgive on a surface level, the emotional memory remains intact. They remember how situations made them feel, especially when those feelings were repeated over time. As a result, emotional distance becomes a protective mechanism rather than a punishment. The empath is not trying to hurt the other person, they are trying to protect their own emotional stability. Once they recognize that a pattern is unlikely to change, they begin to adjust accordingly. Over time, this leads to a permanent shift in the relationship dynamic. What once felt open and deeply connected becomes more guarded and limited. Trust is no longer freely given, and emotional access is no longer automatic. The empath may still care, but the way they engage has fundamentally changed. In the end, what empaths struggle to forgive is not human imperfection or isolated mistakes, but the repeated violation of emotional consistency. One moment of error can be understood, but repeated patterns create clarity. And once clarity is reached, emotional boundaries naturally follow, redefining the relationship in a quieter but lasting way. Another key element in how empaths respond to emotional harm is the way they silently evaluate trust over time rather than reacting to single events. For an empath, trust is not something that is given once and kept forever. It is something that is continuously confirmed through behavior, consistency, and emotional reliability. When those elements remain stable, trust grows. When they begin to fluctuate, trust begins to weaken. At the start of relationships, empaths often give people a high level of emotional access. They listen deeply, understand quickly, and invest with sincerity. This openness comes from their natural tendency to connect with others on an emotional level. They do not usually assume bad intentions immediately, even when mistakes happen. Instead, they try to understand the emotional context behind actions. However, over time, if emotional behavior does not remain consistent, their internal perception begins to change. They start noticing repetition rather than isolated incidents. A single mistake may be forgotten, but a repeated pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This shift is subtle at first, but it is extremely important in how they evaluate relationships. Empaths are particularly sensitive to emotional cycles. They notice when apologies are followed by temporary change, only for the same behavior to return later. They observe when promises are made in emotional moments, but not supported by long-term action. These repeated inconsistencies create an internal record that shapes how safe they feel in the relationship. As this record builds, emotional engagement begins to shift. The empath may still participate in communication, but the depth of emotional investment starts decreasing. They become more careful with what they share, more selective with their vulnerability, and more observant of behavior over time. This is not a sudden reaction, but a gradual withdrawal of emotional openness. One of the most misunderstood parts of this process is that it is rarely visible to the other person. Because empaths often remain calm and respectful even when they are withdrawing, others may assume nothing has changed. But internally, the empath has already restructured how much trust is available in the relationship. This internal restructuring is based on pattern recognition. Empaths do not rely on isolated moments to define someone. They rely on consistency. When consistency is broken repeatedly, emotional safety cannot remain stable. Even if forgiveness is expressed verbally, the internal sense of safety has already shifted. At this stage, emotional distance becomes a form of protection rather than punishment. The empath is not trying to retaliate. They are simply responding to what they have learned through repeated experience. Once they recognize that behavior is unlikely to change, they adjust their emotional boundaries accordingly. Over time, this leads to a noticeable change in the relationship dynamic. The empath may still care, but their emotional availability is reduced. Trust is no longer automatic. Vulnerability is no longer freely given. The connection becomes more controlled and less emotionally open than before. What many people fail to realize is that empaths rarely forget emotional patterns. Even when they choose to move forward, they remember how they were treated consistently over time. This memory influences how much emotional risk they are willing to take in the future. Ultimately, what empaths struggle to forgive is not isolated mistakes, but repeated emotional inconsistency that breaks trust over and over again. One error can be understood and processed, but patterns create certainty. And once that certainty forms, emotional boundaries naturally change, often permanently, reshaping the relationship in a quiet but irreversible way. Another deeper layer in understanding how empaths process emotional harm is recognizing that their forgiveness is not emotional forgetfulness. Many people assume that if someone appears calm, kind, or still engaged, then the emotional impact of past behavior has disappeared. For empaths, this is not accurate. They may continue to function normally on the surface, but internally they maintain a detailed emotional awareness of how they have been treated over time. At the beginning of relationships, empaths often give trust generously. They are willing to see potential in people and understand behavior through context rather than judgment. When someone makes a mistake, they usually try to interpret it in a balanced way. They ask questions internally like what caused this behavior? Was it stress, misunderstanding, or emotional pressure? This creates space for compassion even in difficult moments. However, over time, if emotional behavior does not improve or remains inconsistent, something shifts internally. The empath begins to recognize that they are not dealing with isolated mistakes, but with a repeating structure. This is where their perception changes significantly. They stop focusing on single events and begin focusing on behavioral patterns. This pattern recognition becomes the foundation of how they evaluate trust. Empaths are highly sensitive to consistency. They notice whether words align with actions, whether apologies are followed by change, and whether emotional behavior remains stable over time. When inconsistency becomes frequent, emotional safety begins to weaken, even if nothing is said out loud. One of the most important aspects of this process is that it is gradual. There is rarely a single moment where everything changes. Instead, there are small accumulations of experience that slowly reshape how the empath feels about the relationship. Each repeated action adds another layer of emotional information, reinforcing the internal understanding that something is not stable. As this understanding develops, emotional engagement begins to shift. The empath may still communicate, still show kindness, and still remain respectful, but their internal investment starts to decrease. They begin holding parts of themselves back without necessarily announcing it. Vulnerability becomes more selective, and emotional openness becomes more controlled. This change is often not noticed immediately by the other person. Because empaths rarely respond with dramatic confrontation, the transition appears subtle. From the outside, everything may seem normal. However, internally, trust is no longer expanding. It is either stagnant or slowly decreasing. Empaths do not typically operate from a place of anger when this shift occurs. Instead, they operate from recognition. Once they see a pattern clearly enough, they stop expecting it to change without evidence. This recognition creates emotional boundaries naturally. It is not a punishment, it is a response to repeated experience. Over time, this leads to emotional distancing. Not necessarily physical distance, but a reduction in emotional depth. Conversations may continue, interactions may remain polite, but the sense of closeness is no longer the same. The empath has already adjusted their level of trust based on what they have consistently observed. What makes this especially significant is that empaths rarely reset emotional memory easily. Even if they choose to forgive verbally or continue the relationship, the internal record remains. They remember how often inconsistency occurred, how many times patterns repeated, and how emotional safety was affected over time. This is why what empaths struggle to forgive is not a single mistake or moment of imperfection. It is repeated emotional inconsistency that undermines trust again and again. One incident can be understood, processed, and even accepted, but repetition transforms uncertainty into clarity. Once clarity is reached, emotional boundaries naturally shift. The empath no longer relies on hope alone, but on observed behavior. This shift is quiet but powerful. It changes how they engage, how they trust, and how deeply they allow someone into their inner world. And once that level of access is reduced, it is rarely restored to what it once was, because the emotional evidence that created the distance remains part of their understanding forever.